In watching all kinds of videos online about the Panasonic S1R2's rolling shutter performance, I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper. After looking at this and making this chart here, I think that what happened is that folks like Gerald Undone kind of freaked out about the poor, slow sensor readout of this camera in high resolution modes like 8K. So if you look at this chart here, the S1R2 is slow at 8K 24, 23.5 milliseconds. And that's with its dynamic range boost off. With it on, it's 31.3 milliseconds. This is surprising because the DJI Ronin 8K, with its dynamic range toggle switch boost off, was 16.3 milliseconds, which is a pretty good score. It's not exactly stack sensor, but it's good enough, I would say, pretty close. And then, of course, if you turned on that dynamic range boost toggle, then the DJI Ronin, which allegedly is the same sensor as the S1R2, goes to 29.9 milliseconds. The DJI Ronin 8K, which allegedly is the same sensor as the S1R2, has wildly different performance in 8K here. As you can see, with its dynamic range boost toggled off, the readout speed is 16.3 milliseconds. That's pretty fast. It's not quite stack sensor range, as you can see in this chart here, but it's not bad. That's a pretty decent score. The rolling shutter wouldn't look that bad on this sensor. But then, of course, if you turn on that dynamic range boost toggle, the DJI Ronin sensor goes up to 29.9 milliseconds, not that different from the 31.3 of the S1R Mark II. Rolling shutter would be bad here. And then what's interesting is, if you look at the Nikon Z8, 14.5 milliseconds, the Sony A1 II, depending on who you ask, 16.6 or 15.1 milliseconds, the Canon R5 II, 17.3 milliseconds, the Fuji X-H2S can't do it. The 8K DJI Ronin is like right up there. So I don't understand what happened with the S1R2's readout speed. It's got to be a processing thing or a firmware thing. You can see the other frame rates here that I listed. These are the ones that Gerald Undone mentions in his videos. Unfortunately, he's fairly inconsistent about the frame rates he tests on different cameras, as you can see from this chart. But broadly, he has tested 8K 24 on pretty much all the flagships, and then he tested 4K 24. And then he tested 4K 24 across most of these cameras except for the DJI camera. Looking at that 4K 24, again, the Lumix is pretty bad. 23.3 milliseconds with the DR off, with the DR boost on, 31.2 milliseconds. It's like, basically the same as 8K 24. That doesn't make any sense. It should be cut in half, or at least somewhat faster, you would think, given like the less drag that 4K should have on an 8K sensor, even if it's being downsampled. So there's something weird there. Again, unfortunately, Gerald Undone didn't mention how the DJI Ronin 8K sensor does, so I can't tell if it also would have the same performance, 16.3 milliseconds in 4K 24 downsampled, or even better. We just don't know. I also couldn't find that information on Cinedy, so I just don't have that information. So yeah, that's sort of the frustrating thing about this, is that I don't know that I have enough information without having the S1R Mark II in my hands to really say how accurate all these YouTubers are and how much they should be freaking out, because there's so many holes in the information that people have provided, including Gerald Undone. So, but just to complete the discussion here on the chart, if you look across, you can see, the stack sensor cameras do much better. 14.5 milliseconds for the Nikon Z8, 8.1 milliseconds from the Sony A1 II. That's really impressive. 17.3 milliseconds in the R5 II, but they have like a line skipped or like a non-downsampled 4K that then drops it to 9.7, which is pretty good. And then the X-H2S from Fuji also is at 9.7 milliseconds. So all much faster at 4K 24, kind of like the frame rate you would use the most, I would think, than like the S1R. And I'm not sure about the DJI Ronin. And then if you look at 4K 60, have a lot more information there. The dynamic range boost toggle thing doesn't work on the S1R and DJI sensor. So you're just looking at the dynamic range boost off. So you lose half a stop or so in the highlights. But there, not too bad. S1R2, 15.1 milliseconds. That's really not that bad. The DJI Ronin 8K, 16.1 milliseconds, which is, almost the same as 8K and then actually worse than 8K 24. So that's sort of interesting. Just not consistent. The sensor is not consistent, at least the way it's implemented in the S1R2. And then, of course, going across, you get some monster quick readout speeds. The Z8's got 4.9 milliseconds. I would assume the Sony cameras are even faster, although I don't have that information. You see the Fuji 5.3 milliseconds. Remember, it's an APS-C camera, so it's got less sensor to read, but that's still really impressive. And then in 4K 120, the S1R drops to 7.19 milliseconds, whereas the Z8 would be 4.9 milliseconds and the R5 II is 7.1 milliseconds. One other notable hole in the information I could find on YouTube and the internet was that we don't know what the frame rate, or the sensor readout rather, is for the S1R Mark II in 4K Super 35, the crop sensor. On the DJI Ronin 8K, it's 14.3 milliseconds. That's pretty darn good, right? Or good enough, at least. So if the S1R2 is there, you've got several modes where the sensor readout is probably plenty fast for most applications. Then if you go across here, Z8's got 9.6 milliseconds, Sony A1 II is 11.1, Fuji X-H2S 9.7 milliseconds, again, APS-C. So looking at this, I come to a number of different conclusions, or I have a bunch of questions based on this. First of all, again, just want to repeat, it's kind of frustrating that, these reviewers like Gerald Undone don't do the exact same frame rates for all the cameras, or don't provide some sort of chart with all the different frame rates and the tested readout speeds they got. So you've got this information that's got holes in it, right? And, then he's not really comparing it across cameras necessarily, except in some mentions occasionally, right? So you get these inconsistent results where, like, as you can see, I've highlighted here, there's this weird thing where the Lumix S1R2's 8K 24 readout should be way faster, but it's not. And that's largely, I think, where it's getting hit with all these YouTube reviews. And then, in terms of like a workaround, either raising the frame rate to 4K 60 or potentially going to 4K Super 35, and we don't know, that's why I've yelled that out, we don't know what that speed is. You could use those as workarounds if you needed, a faster sensor readout speed. You're going to do some whip pans, you just flip it into 4K 60, and then you can put it into a 4K 24 timeline and you'll be fine. And like the rolling shutter should be okay. 4K Super 35 might be an even better workaround if we knew the readout speed, but we don't because he didn't provide it. So yeah, so I think the point of that whole little rant is that I think that, I think he said it. I will say that he didn't just not say this, but Gerald Undone seems like he kind of emphasized certain things in his video that he knew would get a little, feathers ruffled, make a little kerfuffle. He's made 3 videos on the topic now, I think he kind of knew what he was doing. I think the real takeaway should be, if you know how to use your camera, there's some pretty darn easy workarounds so that rolling shutter shouldn't be too much of an issue, I think more of the story, I can get into this in another video, more of the story should be that, like, this is a cinema sensor. This is the only camera with a sensor in it that's like come out of another camera that was used to make major Hollywood films, right? Like the latest Mel Gibson movie, the airplane hostage movie, a lot of that was filmed on the DJI Ronin. So, there you go. So yeah, so a few more sort of like just, rapid fire thoughts, questions, comments about all of this. One is there something with the full frame stack sensors that these other companies can't do OpenGate? Is that why Lumix had to use a non-stack sensor, because it wanted to keep OpenGate one of its key advantage features over other brands in its camera in the S1R Mark II? A counter argument to this is that the X-H2S does do OpenGate. Fuji figured out how to do it, but that's an APS-C sensor. So I wonder, is there something about OpenGate when you put it on a stack sensor that's full frame that blows up the processor, it overheats it or something? I don't know. Otherwise, you would think at least Sony by now would have made their cameras OpenGate. You would think Nikon also was at least working on it. Like they're trying to come up, they've got red, all this stuff. But so far that hasn't happened. So open question there. I kind of said this before, but, I think also something that Gerald Undone kind of said, but, didn't totally emphasize as much as he could have, is that it seems like a lot of this, sensor readout speed stuff could be fixed very easily in firmware by Lumix. If they offered some more not downsampled line skip modes, that would increase the sensor speed. I think there's something wrong with the 8K 24 readout. It should probably be closer to that 16.3 milliseconds, which would be fine, I think, in most cases. And that might just be a firmware thing. So, Panasonic A needs to take a look at all this and fix the firmware where it can so you get closer to those readout speeds that the DJI had. And then 2, give more readout modes and, line skip modes, those kinds of things. Then you'll get around this rolling shutter a lot faster. Again, going back to the theme that if you know how to use your camera, this whole rolling shutter thing is kind of silly. There's some modes in the S1R2 that would work as perfectly fine workarounds for those times when you would need that faster readout speed. Along those same lines, I think Panasonic should have done a better job of sort of marketing, okay, certain modes in this camera are meant for the camera on a tripod. The dynamic range boost mode, the toggle on, really seems like it should be just for when the camera's on a tripod. Kind of like the sensor shift higher resolution thing of old, although supposedly the S1R2 makes it so you can use their awesome stabilization to do without a tripod, but I think you see what I mean. If that mode is really just for a tripod, not for when the camera's moving, say that, then you don't get this kerfuffle, all these ding-dong YouTubers who don't understand how these things work, saying, oh, the rolling shutter is terrible in this dynamic range boost mode when it's on, It's like, well, it's not meant for a moving sensor, and then, you just look silly when you do that. So yeah, so ultimately, I think I need to get my hands on the S1R2 to really sort of figure out what's going on here. I do wonder if there are some other hidden advantages of this not stacked sensor, like better color fidelity, just overall better image quality, like more cinematic image quality, that kind of a thing. But until then, I guess I'll just have to wonder, is most of this kind of just stuff that can be fixed quickly with firmware, where you're getting, like an 10, 11 to 15 millisecond readout on the sensor, which for me would be good enough for most things. And then like, if that's true, if you can get it down to that for most modes, and then you put it in crop mode, that would probably put it at 8, 9, which then is in that sort of stack sensor, territory. And then maybe you didn't really need the stack sensor. It's pretty clear the S1R2 is not made for sports or wildlife. Hopefully Lumix will come out with a stack sensor camera that does that, if this was the thinking. But, beyond that, if they can just kind of tweak that with firmware, turn on some more modes to allow that kind of a thing, then that might sort of shut down this whole rolling shutter thing. Something to think about. So let me know your thoughts. Did you kind of do this same thought exercise? Did you kind of make this chart maybe in your head, not write it out like I did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Good God.